Shall we get started? Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's about 1 o'clock and time to get started. Welcome to the 2011 World Dairy Expo. My name's Jim Quigley. I'm the Director of Calf Operations for APC, located in Ankeny, Iowa, and we're very pleased to sponsor today's seminar entitled Baby Calf Nutrition, Getting Your Future Off to a Good Start. Today's speaker is Dr. Jim Drakely from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Drakely is a professor of animal sciences and nutritional sciences at the University of Illinois. During his tenure, his research is focused on nutrition and metabolism of dairy cows during the transition period, fat feeding and metabolism, and aspects of calf nutrition and management. Jim has published extensively and received numerous professional awards for the research that he and his students have conducted. For those interested, the seminar is approved for continuing education credits through the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists and the American Association of Veterinary State Boards, the RACE program. If you're interested, forms are available for RACE credits in the back of the room. So I'd ask now if you do two things for me. First of all, please silence your phones. And second, help me in welcoming Dr. Drakely.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to work with Dr. Quigley over the years. I met him a few years back now, probably more than either one of us wants to remember. I was also thinking, as an old farm kid, Expo is always a big event, and I remember coming here to judge dairy cattle with the South Dakota State University dairy team 30 years ago. I calculated that, so that's a little scary. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be back here, and I'm glad to have the chance to visit with you today. I'm going to talk with you about some of the research that we've been doing over the last several years and some of the aspects of implementation into what we'll call biologically appropriate calf nutrition. All right, so what the heck is that? This would go by a lot of names: accelerated feeding or nutrition, enhanced early nutrition, intensified early nutrition, full potential feeding. I like to call it biologically appropriate growth because the principles are really pretty simple. We're just trying to return the nutrition of the calf closer to what mom would do during the critical first 2 or 3 weeks of life. And so one of the questions that I'll put forward to you, some people always argue that calves will catch up if you start them less aggressively with milk feeding and allow them to catch up later on dry feed. And I'll pose the question to you, not that I can fully answer it yet, but does that calf ever catch up? Are there things that we do in our conventional limit feeding programs that will impair the ability of that animal to develop into her most profitable adult life as a cow? And so we'll visit some of those questions here today as we move forward. So what I'm going to do for you today, just an outline here of a little bit on health management and setting the stage appropriately. It always starts with colostrum. You've heard that story a million times before, but it doesn't mean it's not still important. And we'll talk a little bit about early nutrition, requirements for growth, the practical implementation of these more aggressive programs, a bit about starter and weaning management, because that's a critically important part of the program, and some data on where this might lead us to future production down the road. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about group housing and auto feeding programs, which I think is a real exciting complement to these ideas. All right, so let's start with some goals. And each of you in this room that works with calves probably has your own set of goals for the calf enterprise. But I would think that probably these aspects here would come out on most of our lists. First of all, we need to keep calves healthy. And I think it's a sad state of affairs that just having them live is seen as a sign of success. I think as an industry we ought to be a bit embarrassed by that. We want rapid growth of frame size, skeleton, and muscle tissue. We want optimal fat deposition. We don't want to fatten these. We're not talking about producing veal calves, but there's a certain amount of fat that goes with normal development. We, of course, need to transition the calf to a functioning ruminant. So the dry feed, the starter aspects are critically important. We're not talking about keeping this animal a monogastric or pre-ruminant for the first several months of life. And finally, down the road, you want that calf to be able to breed successfully and have high production up to her genetic ability. So there's several areas of potential economic advantage for these accelerated programs or biologically appropriate programs. First and most obvious is to capitalize on this very rapid growth potential in the young calf that we have not taken advantage of historically and conventionally. This is actually the period of the most efficient increase in frame. From birth onward, that efficiency of frame development steadily decreases. And along with that, then, we could decrease the days to breeding and first calving if we're doing things right. There's some evidence that we may improve the ability of calves to withstand health challenges because of better nutritional status. And again, the idea of perhaps improving future productivity. So we'll start out with health. And growth and health are intimately related in all young animals. And if we look at the incidence of disease and healthy growth and feed intake, they're inversely related. We know this from swine production or poultry production or dairy production, that facilities with a high disease load here, the animals don't do as well. And so the aspects of health management are really intertwined with the ability of the calf to grow and grow efficiently. And so that all starts with colostrum management. And again, you've probably heard this many times, but the 3 Q's of quickly, adequate quantity, quality of the colostrum, and then recently we've had to add a C, cleanliness, because we've discovered the huge potential for contamination on farm from obtaining the colostrum from the cow all the way through to feeding. We need to keep that clean. Dr. McGurk from the University of Wisconsin describes this for many years as fighting the impact of early manure meals. And I know that on each of your farms you would never find anything like that, but some of your neighbors have cows that look like that. And that's a big risk for contamination of the young calf at a very vulnerable time. So colostrum, you know the story about being so important for immune protection, vital to provide those antibodies. But it's also the gatekeeper for growth. There are many factors within colostrum, besides just those antibodies, that are responsible for turning on the digestive system, for turning on the muscle to start growing. And so we need all of those factors as well as the antibodies. Plus, plus it's a tremendous source of nutrition. And remember that this is the first meal for the young calf, and we need to get some nutrients in her to begin the growth process. There's quite a bit of evidence in the scientific literature about negative impacts of colostrum deprivation, besides just the health aspect. So if we look at calves with failure of passive transfer, FPT, just as an index of colostrum intake, for example, calves that had low colostrum intake had increased time to first calving. They had decreased average gain along with that, and they had less milk and fat yield in the first lactation. Okay, so there's a lot of longer-term effects than just keeping that calf alive. Here's an interesting study from the University of Arizona several years ago. Brown Swiss calves were fed either 2 liters of colostrum, basically 2 quarts of colostrum, or 4 quarts at birth, within an hour after birth, and then from there on, everything was identical. So the only difference was that volume of the first feeding. Those calves went on to gain substantially more rapidly. They were slightly younger at conception. More of them were around after 2 lactations, and they had a greater milk yield over those first 2 lactations. One difference, doubling the volume of colostrum consumed in that first meal. There's some recent research going on at Cornell University that's basically confirming at least the growth parts of this. The lactation information is not available yet. So critically important again. From the growth standpoint, then, we have to have the colostrum in there to take advantage of better nutrition. So here's some data from our research program from a couple of years ago. We had purchased bull calves that we brought into our facility, and they were fed either a conventional limit feeding program or one of these more aggressive intensified programs. And then after the study, we separated them, classified them by whether they had adequate or inadequate colostrum status. So the calves on the control or the limited feeding, poor colostrum status or good status. Same thing here for the intensified or the higher rate of milk feeding. So you can see the average IgG content, antibody content in blood was much higher for the good. That just shows how we broke out these calves. With the limit feeding, the average daily gains here were not different. Colostrum didn't seem to make that much difference, but it did with the higher plane of nutrition. The calves that had adequate colostrum were able to take advantage of those of the greater supply of nutrients and gain weight more rapidly. So again, there's a number of these types of studies available in the scientific literature. We know that also many nutrients, most every nutrient that you could identify, impacts the immune system and the ability of calves to stay healthy, including water, the most basic and the most often forgotten. Amounts of energy, protein, vitamins, particularly vitamins E and A, all of the minerals, but we think of selenium and copper and zinc as being very important in the function of the immune system and development of the immune system. We also have a lot of non-nutritional feed additives that would interact or come into play here, and you can find a lot of them out in the hallways here behind us. So I'll just show a little bit of, we've worked actually with a number of these. I'll show you some data actually from a project that we did with APC and Dr. Quigley, and this was looking at serum proteins. The idea that there are functional proteins that have roles beyond just the nutritional supply of an amino acid source. They have other bioactive effects on health or growth of the calf. Serum proteins prepared from blood have been shown to have beneficial effects on intestinal health in other species, and so we wondered what the effect would be in calves. We used calves that were stressed by transport and cold stress to test these ideas. So the objective of the study that was conducted a couple of years ago by one of my graduate students was to look at, actually looked at two things, an arrival formula that had some serum proteins, I won't talk about that specifically today, but also the gamulin product, which is largely a serum protein product. And again, we looked at calves that were brought into our facility. These were all done in the winter months in Illinois, so this just shows the temperature. This is in degrees Celsius, so this is 32 degrees freezing. The point of the slide is that most of the time here, these calves were all below their lower critical temperature, the point at which they have to use energy to help keep themselves warm. So they were cold stressed. And we had three groups of calves here. We looked at supplementation with gamulin or not over the first 14 days of life. Here's the survival percentage. Again, these are largely colostrum-deprived bull calves transported about 300 miles in the winter. Okay, so we have a fairly high death loss. But the supplementation of gamulin here, there was only one calf out of about 40-some that were assigned here that died that had gamulin, and a larger number that died that did not have the supplementation. We also had a number of other measurements of health status for the calves that lived that were improved by the gamulin supplementation. So we're pretty excited about the potential of that product to help adjustment of calves, particularly in harsh conditions or stressful conditions. All right, so back to nutrition in a bit more detail here. I want to start by thinking about what is the normal, natural behavior of the calf. If we would take out our management systems and look at what the calf would do given its own instincts and its own genetics. So that calf, if we left it with a cow, would nurse 6 to 8 times daily for 5 to 10 minutes each. It would consume 16 to 24% of body weight after the first few days of life as milk. That's a lot of milk, several gallons. A 110-pound calf would consume this much milk, over 20 pounds daily, or up to 3 pounds of dry matter, dry milk solids by the third week of life. And they would consume enough nutrients then to grow as much as 3 pounds per day. So Mother Nature's feeding program, again, looks something like this. Cow's milk is 25 to 26% protein on a dry solids basis. the feeding rate for that calf would be at least twice of what we think of as a standard normal feeding rate. So 2.5 pounds of solids a day instead of 1.25 pounds if we're feeding calves a limited amount. The feeding method, of course, is a teat, not an open bucket. The first solid feeds, if we think about the evolution of cattle, would have been lush spring grass, right, because they're spring calvers. And lush young grass is very full of sugars and other highly digestible material that lead to fairly high butyrate fermentations. And so that's one of the things we know that stimulates rumen development of the functional ability of the rumen. And weaning, of course, would be much later, a longer period of time on milk, and a more gradual process than what we do typically in dairy operations. So what happens if you leave a modern Canadian genetics Holstein calf on the cow? This was a study done a number of years ago now at the University of British Columbia. They left a group of calves with the dams to nurse ad libitum, and they compared that with a group of calves fed a limited amount of milk from a bucket, the blue amount here, 10% of body weight, I believe. And you can see at 2 weeks of age, the calves here were much heavier, much larger if they'd been left with a dam, which is almost all due to the fact that they're consuming much more milk. So the average growth rates over that first 2 weeks of life were 2.3 pounds versus 0.8 of a pound. So a huge potential there for calves to grow early. We just haven't managed them that way typically. So our historical convention in North America and much of the other parts of the world has been to limit feed calves, typically 8 to 10% of body weight per day. This was designed to promote early intake of starter and allow early weaning. The starter itself doesn't provide much in the way of nutrition to the calf until at least the second week of life because, well, they're starting from nothing, right, and they have to increase that intake. And as a result of this, then, early growth becomes very proportional to the rate of starter intake. So we can see that in a data set like this. This is from the Purina research facility many years ago. Developed one of the first pretty successful, very early weaning programs. Well, those calves were fed 1 pound of milk replacer powder per day for the first 3 weeks of life. That was cut in half, dropped one of the feedings in the 4th week, and then they were weaned at the end of 4 weeks. Pretty aggressive early weaning program. Worked pretty well with good management. So what I've plotted for you here is the average daily gain in the red line and the starter intake in the blue line. So that limited amount of milk replacer would support about, somewhere here, about 1/4 pound of average daily gain daily. So in the first week of life, that's about where they ended up. Same in the second week of life. Starter intake very low in the first week, increasing progressively after that. And the calves really start growing once the starter intake increases enough to provide those nutrients. But notice at the 3rd week, in the 4th week, when they cut one of the milk replacer feedings, the rates of growth slow a little bit as the starter intake is increasing tremendously. And that's because the starter still can't replace milk solids in terms of the efficiency of nutrient use in that young calf. Okay, so the rate of growth here, where we're limiting amount of milk fed to 1 pound and 1 pound or 1.25 pounds of solids, is very much dependent on how quickly those calves start to consume starter. And so during that time, we can look at other factors, behavioral factors, for instance. This, again, is more work from the British Columbia group and looks at the number of calls or vocalizations by calves, comparing 5 quarts of milk per day versus 8 quarts of milk. Okay? The calves that were on the smaller amount of milk called an average of 31 times a day versus only 5 times a day for the calves fed the higher amount. Okay, a lot of us thought that that's just what calves do. You walk on a farm and they start bawling. Okay, it doesn't really need to be that way. Also, they were more restless, more active, which again is a sign that that's not what calves need to be doing. The calves on the smaller amount of milk had more unrewarded visits to the feeder. They were hungry. They were trying to go get milk, but the feeder wasn't giving them any. So that's an unrewarded visit. more competitive displacement. They're butting calves out of the way, trying to get milk. And they spend an hour longer standing. That's huge. Calves spend like 90% of their time lying down. Okay? If they're not lying down and resting, they're doing something unproductive unless it's eating. And we know that if we feed a greater amount of milk early in life, we can increase the rates of growth. This is a study in which the amount of milk solids is approximately double. And in particular, it's the early part of life that we're interested here. We want to understand if this early difference in growth during the first 2 to 3 weeks of life makes a difference. Because the rates of growth after that become pretty similar. Once the calf is eating dry feed, there's not as big an issue. So it's that very early period in life that we're interested in. So we know the nutrient requirements for growth, and if you want calves to grow more rapidly, you have to feed them more. Yeah, no, that's a pretty difficult concept. But they have to eat more of something. So here's various growth rates here from about a half a pound a day up to over 2 pounds a day. Dry matter intake necessary as a percentage of body weight, just considering milk in this case. We have to consume more energy, more protein, and the feed, the milk, has to contain a greater percentage of protein because of the way that protein and energy requirements are interrelated. And so this is why the milk replacers for the so-called accelerated programs contain 26, 28% protein. We need that higher protein to furnish the body tissue that's being put on more rapidly in those calves. So we understand the requirements for nutrients fairly well. And the calves understand this too. This is just a simple study where we compared 3 different feeding rates of the same milk replacer. The calves that were fed at 10% of body weight, 14%, 18% of body weight. You can see the increase in average daily gain. And the gain becomes more efficient also. If you look at the numbers in the bars there, those are the gain to feed ratios. So it's like the dilution of maintenance idea. There's more output for a given amount of maintenance expenditure. And we can manipulate the composition of the gain by the protein and energy content of the diet. So in this case, we had milk replacers ranging from 14% protein up to 26% protein. This is the gain of protein or fat over the first 35 days. If we're limiting in protein, such as a 14% protein milk replacer would be, we deposit less of the nutrients as body protein and more as fat. There's not enough protein there to fuel lean tissue growth, muscle and bone. As we increase protein supply in the diet, more protein is put down in the animal and less of the nutrients accumulate as fat. So if we're doing this right, we're not fattening the animal again. We're fueling the growth of the frame of the young animal, which is what we're after. All right, so what about some practical implementation aspects of these programs? Here's some goals that were originally put forward by Mike Van Amberg a few years ago and actually now have been largely incorporated into the new gold standards of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association. Doubling the birth weight by 8 weeks of age, or 56 days. Okay, that's harder to do than we might think. We often overestimate weight gains on the farm. Mortality less than 5%. For some of you in this room, that might be a disaster if you had 5% death loss, and that's great. But there are too many farms that are way above that. Oops, I'm sorry. Morbidity or sickness treatments, less than 10%. That's a pretty aggressive goal too, but it can be done. So why this emphasis on the greater early growth? Well, we can achieve breeding size at an earlier age, which may reduce the age at first calving, or increase the body weight, the development, frame growth at calving, increasing potential for internal herd growth, maybe increasing milk yield. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, and potentially increasing herd life. So a number of factors that have been involved in putting forward some goals for successful calf management. In order to achieve those goals, there are a number of important aspects of the calf program. Again, most of these are not particularly new or unique. The colostrum program we've already talked about. provision of supplemental water, still limiting on a lot of farms. You have to have free choice water available all the time. Selecting the appropriate milk replacer. We've talked a little bit about the nutrient requirements there. Aspects of starter management and weaning management. What we do with the calves post-weaning as they move into the heifer growing groups. And things like calf source, housing, environment will all impact the success of these programs as well. Transported calves, colostrum-deprived calves won't do as well as well-managed calves born on the farm and having adequate colostrum. So here's an example milk replacer program for intensified or appropriate growth. The milk replacers typically contain 25 to 28%. I hope that isn't me. Thought I turned mine off. Feeding rates 25 to 28% protein. Fat contents 15 to 20%. The feeding rates, again, higher than typically thought of. So we've used a simple program of 1.5% of body weight on a solids basis in the first week, and then 2% of that body weight after that. Dropping feeding is an important aspect of the weaning process. So we typically would drop the afternoon feeding somewhere in week 5 or 6 or 7, and weaning at the end of about week 6. So I'll show you an example experiment that was done a few years ago just to illustrate some of these ideas. This was an experiment with calves born at our dairy, heifers and bulls. We had 3 treatments here: a conventional limit-fed milk replacer and a conventional starter. So 18% starter on an as-fed basis and a 20% protein, 20% fat milk replacer. We had an enhanced or intensified milk replacer, 28% protein, 15% fat, fed at a higher rate. And we also looked at the conventional starter with that, or a higher protein, higher nutrient starter. This shows the milk replacer intakes, just to kind of set up the design of the experiment. The conventional calves had a limited amount of milk replacer here and a constant rate, 1.25 pounds of powder per day approximately. The intensified calves started off a little bit higher and progressively increased then up to week 5. During the 6th week, we dropped one of the 2 feedings in preparation for weaning. So both of the enhanced feeding treatments had a significant impact on height, stature at the withers compared with the conventional calves. And there was no difference here due to the starter formulation going along with the milk replacer. One of the things that is very true and very predictable about these higher milk feeding programs is that starter intake will be delayed about 2 weeks or so. So you can see the starter intake here in the conventional calves increases more quickly. The pattern is the same in the other 2 groups, but it's delayed by a week or 2. And the calf can only eat so much total dry matter, just like a lactating cow. And so more milk solids means less starter in the early period. They do come up to the same starter intakes, however, quite quickly once the weaning process is initiated. But if we're not doing things right, and we didn't in this earlier experiment, I think we know a few more things now than we did then, but we may see a decrease here in total dry matter intake around this time of weaning. And so the potential is there for a stall out or a slumping in growth around the time of weaning. This is intake by day, starter intake by day around the time of weaning. So what's shown here is up to day 35 when we dropped one of the 2 feedings. The conventional or limit-fed group here on the top had greater rates of starter intake. You can see for all the groups that when we drop that amount of milk feeding, the starter intake quickly increases for 2 to 3 days after that, comes up to a new plateau for several days.
That's in grams?
This is in grams, yep, sorry. Yeah. And at the time of weaning, then the same thing. The intake will increase quite rapidly over the next 2 to 3 days of life. Okay. Some indication here that the higher protein starter was improving the the rate of starter intake for the calves that were on the enhanced or intensified program. Okay, so we know that the calves will gain more rapidly during the milk feeding period. That's not just fattening, it's frame development. The higher crude protein starter was beneficial for calves on the accelerated systems, improved starter intake, less of a weaning slump, and I didn't show you the data, but better growth for the first few weeks after weaning as well. Now, one of the things that we think about, and for those of you on the farm that might have body weights at birth and at weaning or at some time period, we calculate gains just based on a couple of available time points. If we as researchers can measure that more frequently, you see a pattern that's something like this. So this is average daily gain, in kilograms per day, by week over the milk feeding period. Much higher here and increasing steadily for the intensified calves, but the rate of gain then dropped dramatically during that time of weaning. But it's not negative, right? These calves are still gaining. Instead of 2 pounds per day, they're down here to about 3/4 of a pound per day, perhaps, during the time of weaning. But it's interesting to look at these changes across the weaning transition. The calves are still gaining, but the rate of gain is slowed during that time period. We'll come back. I'll show you that in a minute here. So weaning is often a time of difficulty on all farms. Sorry. Common concern here with minimizing this growth slump, particularly with higher milk feeding rates. It doesn't have to be. We just may need to think about things a little bit differently. So if you think about the calf's requirements for nutrients at weaning, they're exactly the same as they were before weaning from the standpoint of the tissues of the animal. If we want calves to continue growing at the same rate, they have to have the same quantities of protein or amino acids, the same amount of energy. Problem is we're getting it from a different source. Transitioning them over from milk to the starter or dry feed. So here's the calculated nutrient requirements in terms of the starter needed to satisfy the requirements for different body sizes and average daily gains around weaning. So I've plotted here just a 130-pound calf or a 175-pound calf at weaning, perhaps coming off different strategies, and looking at a higher rate of gain or a slightly lower rate of gain for each of those calves. Just calculating the requirements based on the NRC guidelines. And so the starter required to keep that 130-pound calf growing at 1.3 pounds per day, not really very high rates of growth, is over 3 pounds per day. Up to 5 pounds a day to keep that larger calf growing at the higher rate. Okay, so that's just saying what's the equivalent amount of starter that would satisfy the same rate of gain being achieved by milk. And so if you think about our typical guidelines for weaning and adequate starter intake, they're not that high, are they? So there's going to be a time of adaptation as the animal increases its intake of starter and the ability to utilize that starter. Because of the differences in energy content of the starter and how that energy is used by the calf, we need 1.6 to 1.8 times more starter on a pound of solid basis compared with milk or milk replacer. Okay, so this is not a difficult concept why the calves don't gain as rapidly during that time of weaning. We don't need to be Einstein here to figure that out. It's pretty simple. They're just not eating as much. The nutrient intake is not the same as it was prior to weaning. And there may be some additional factors of the other stress responses of weaning that further complicate that. All right, so how do we better meet the nutrient requirements of calves during this critical weaning transition time? So from a nutritional stress standpoint, we need to focus on starter management, getting the calf to eat as quickly as possible and adapt the rumen for starter use. Some things important there: water management, not weaning before the calf is ready. I should point out the studies that I showed you, we were weaning every calf at 42 days of age, whether they were ready or not. Okay, that was just the design of the study. Weaning gradually, as a minimum, dropping that one feeding, and I'll show you some other data here in a minute, and minimizing hay intake. Actually, quite a bit of interest here recently, going back to look at whether hay, a small amount of hay, is actually a positive or not. But we certainly don't want calves consuming all hay and no calf starter before weaning. So an old study here. Dr. Kurtz would not like me to call that an old study, but several years ago from, again, the Purina facility that illustrates the importance of water. These calves either had free choice ad libitum water available or none. They were fed a limited amount of milk replacer, free choice starter. The calves that had water available gained significantly more weight over the first 4 weeks because they ate a lot more starter. Okay? No difference in scouring or height gains, but those calves need to have water available if we want them to eat dry feed. Okay? The calf's body is about 75% water, and that starter is awfully dry. Going back to the study that I showed you a little bit earlier, with comparing the accelerated treatments to the conventional. This plots the average daily gain in the week of weaning, so once we've eliminated all the milk, versus the starter intake before we started the weaning process. Okay? So what this says is calves that are not eating well before we start to wean them don't gain very well after weaning. Okay, that's, again, it's probably a no-brainer, but it illustrates the importance of greater starter intake by the time we wean the calf in the ability for that calf to keep growing through the weaning transition. And in fact, if you look at, say, a kilo a day, 2.2 pounds of average daily gain would require the calf to be consuming more than 3 pounds a day of starter before that weaning process. So again, this is nothing really new. We've said this for years, that calves have to be eating enough starter to successfully wean. And I think we just need to recalibrate our thinking a little bit about how to wean calves off of a little higher amount of milk with that same principle in mind. Perhaps a little bit more starter before we take it, or a little bit longer in the process. Here's an interesting experiment, totally impractical on your farms, but I think it points out a pretty interesting concept. This was a study that compared essentially double the rate of whole milk feeding versus a constant limited amount here. And so they kept this the rate of feeding constant for about the first 4 weeks, and then gradually stepped that down over the period of about a week to slightly greater than the conventional calves. Kept them at that level for a couple of weeks, and then weaned gradually up to 49 days when they were weaned totally. So that procedure allowed those calves to have much greater starter intake. In fact, greater intakes of starter before weaning than the conventional limit-fed calves. And that continued to diverge here as the calves grew. And that allowed the calves fed these higher amounts of milk initially to continue to grow more rapidly. There's very little slump around the time of weaning for either group, and that weight advantage continues. So I think that demonstrates the idea that we can figure out this idea of how to wean calves more efficiently on these systems. We just maybe are not there yet under a lot of our practical situations. A couple of comments about post-weaning management. These calves obviously need to go on then and go into the heifer rearing system, the first of the heifer raising groups. And we need to have the nutritional management match then with the goals in the early life period. This should all be one continuum of heifer rearing rather than thinking of it as a calf program and a heifer program. So this is an example of a more recent experiment where we were able to maintain growth rates with less of a slump in growth around the time of weaning, and those growth rates continue out through 20 weeks. You can see the difference there, and actually we measured them again at 35 weeks, and the advantage is still there. That's about the equivalent of 2 weeks earlier calving in that group, if you do the math. So the ideas, the things that are important, just a couple of concepts. We need to have adequate metabolizable protein. Enough amino acids there to keep that heifer growing. We need to use one of the models to estimate that quantity. And we often get into situations where energy has to be limited to the heifers once we get to about the time of puberty. Diluting the diet down with something bulky. There's been work on limit feeding at Penn State and the University of Wisconsin. A number of strategies there available. All right, we'll take a look quickly at could what we do to this calf affect what we see down the road. This is a bit of a controversial area yet, and the data are still being accumulated as to what effect this might have on milk production. For years, most of us would never have even thought to ask that question. It seemed foolish because there's so many other things that happen between the milk feeding period and the time that calf actually becomes a milking cow. But there was some research that was done in Israel and in Denmark back in the 1990s that raised some possibilities here that there might be advantages. This was a study where the calves had access to suckling for some period of time. They had more milk production as first calving during their first lactation. A couple of studies in Denmark. This one, 3,000 pounds of milk advantage for cows that had a much higher rate of milk feeding at birth or during the first few weeks of life. These scientists here didn't believe it, so they repeated it and found out it was really only 1,000 pounds, but still that's pretty good. Okay? So these were all studies comparing increased milk feeding versus a limited amount of milk feeding. We went back then and looked at a couple of the very first experiments that were done on these accelerated feeding programs. Actually, we did them as an undergraduate student project and went to look at the milk production of those calves once they had grown up. So there were two trials here, two small trials back in 2001, 2002, 12 and 11 calves, 21 and 21 calves in the second year. These were the same milk replacers. The only difference between the 2 years was a slightly different pattern of changing the volumes and the higher intensified group. These were calves, again, born at our dairy. They were housed in individual hutches and then super hutches and then went into our heifer rearing facility, and we forgot about them. It was not part of our design to follow them further. So here's the growth curves during the early period of life. Kind of similar to what I showed you before. The calves fed the intensified gain much more rapidly during the milk feeding period in both cases, but then a large stall out here in the stage right after weaning. And in fact, by 12 weeks of age, when they went into the super hutch small groups, it completely lost the weight advantage, the size advantage. So the calves that were on the intensified diet did not do as well during that post-weaning period and had come back together in body weight. So they went on to calve at the same age, same body weight, which you might expect since they were no different at 12 weeks. So there was no effect on age or size at calving. But we had a considerable increase in milk production in the first lactation. You can see almost 3,000 pounds of milk in the first trial and a little bit less than 1,000 pounds in the second trial. No statistical differences in the milk component production. So despite losing that advantage in early size or weight gain, we did have this effect of having the heifers produce more milk in the first lactation. Now, since that time, or in the meantime here, a number of other studies have been published, at least in abstract form, and not all of these are statistically significant within study. In fact, most of them are not. But if you look at them, there's no big negatives there, and so it'll be interesting to do a meta-analysis where we put all these studies together and look at the combined effect. But fairly consistently, there's some numerical advantage in milk production. So still an unresolved issue. At the very least, we can say we're not hurting these animals, I think. This is an ongoing project at Cornell University where they're using what's called the test day model, which is similar to a genetic sire proving idea, accounting for all the sources of variation in the animals. They've looked at nearly 800 animals here in the Cornell research herd and found that the average daily gain before weaning accounted for 25% of the variation in first lactation milk production. And Bob Everett is a geneticist, so he was searching for this unexplained environmental component, which always showed up in the sire proofs. Well, this showed a big chunk of that, apparently. And so the relationship here was that for every additional pound of average daily gain before weaning, that was worth almost 500 pounds of milk in the first lactation. So pretty similar to what we might see if we look at the body of work showing those first lactation milk yields from the previous slide. All right, and I'll switch gears here just to finish up, talk a little bit about some ideas that might actually make these nutritional concepts easier to apply on farm. So more interest today in group housing of calves. This has been very common in Europe for the last 20 years, many other parts of the world. Some advantages potentially, the more greater space and comfort, the idea that the calves can interact socially, express their behavior. Labor, maybe not a reduction in total labor, but a redistribution of how that labor is employed. The negatives that are always raised, cross-sucking, competition, and disease. So some of those issues have to be addressed, of course. Just show you a couple points here. The idea of cross-sucking, this is a couple of nice studies from the University of British Columbia again. They found that cross-sucking is very rare among calves that are fed with a nipple rather than an open bucket. And it's also very much less rare in calves that are getting a higher amount of milk versus a very limited amount of milk. The competition issue, again, we have to have enough access to the feeder to allow all calves to drink. And so this is expressed here as the teat to calf ratio. Okay, so here there's more calves than teats, so they're having to compete for feeding space. This is one calf to one teat, and here is a greater availability, less crowded situation. So the number of competitive displacements, calves butting the others out of the way, decreases as the crowding aspect is decreased, and the milk intake goes the other way. The calves will drink more. So again, management of group size and feeder availability is of course pretty important. Another aspect, this is an automated feeding system. So they're looking at the time spent in the feeder. So again, this gets back to those unrewarded visits. The calf can get into the feeder but not get any milk. Calves that were fed a limited amount of milk, 4 liters per day, had about twice the time spent in the feeder per day as the calves that were getting, in this case, ad libitum milk. So again, that's going to impact the carrying capacity, the stocking rate that's possible with an automated feeder. Number of automated feeding systems available. Again, some advantages here potentially for simplifying these ideas of higher early milk feeding. Because we can program rates of increase, we can program rates of decrease to help the weaning process. Systems can be designed then to take advantage of some of these behaviors while minimizing some of the negative problems. So this is an example of an experiment done with an automated feeder. They were programming these calves to have a steady increase in milk intake over the first couple of weeks, held constant for some period of time, and then a gradual weaning process. So simplifying, again, the management of those changes in amounts. And again, the amount of milk affects the occupancy or capacity of the feeding system. So calves that had the limited amount of milk had, again, much greater number of visits to the feeder, particularly after time in the day when they were getting hungry. They spent a lot more time in the feeder than the calves that were getting adequate amount of milk over the course of the day. So the use of these automated feeders certainly is made more efficient actually by feeding greater amounts of milk in terms of the number of calves that could be fed. All right, so I'm just going to summarize here some of the points, and we'll open it up to some questions. Adequate colostrum intake. Again, it's still important in 2011. That hasn't changed. Affects health, growth, and probably future production. The intensified or biologically appropriate nutrition programs clearly increase pre-weaning growth rates. Calves are not fattening if we're doing it appropriately. The largest growth advantage will come with calves that have adequate colostrum intake and a comfortable low-stress environment. Starter and post-weaning management of nutrition are critical to maintain the advantages of the early growth. Overall, the evidence is suggesting at least that we may have a beneficial effect on subsequent milk production. If we're breeding heifers by size, not age, if we're growing them more rapidly, we should be able to decrease the age at first calving. Didn't show you calculations or data, but the cost of gain is roughly the same, give or take a little. Some cases might be a little bit more expensive, some cases actually less expensive on a cost of gain basis. And group housing and automated feeding may be a real exciting way to take advantage of some of these biological possibilities that we have available. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, or at least I hope you enjoyed your nap after lunch, and open up to some questions now. Mo.
Jim, do you think there's more medicated milk replacer being fed today than there was in the past? Because our management has gotten better, people are getting away from it?
Say that again. Do I think there's more now because management is better?
No, there's less.
There's less? Okay.
That's what's like when you
Yeah. So the question was, do I think there's less medicated milk replacer being fed because our management is improving? I think I haven't seen recent figures for the last few years, but in general, I think there's less being fed. In talking with the manufacturers, they're selling less medicated. I think that's part of it. The management is better. I think also people are hearing the messages about antibiotic resistance and so on, and so they're thinking more critically about whether it's justified. We still see a lot of it, and some of you're well aware, in some of the calf ranches that are dealing with calves that are less able to manage successfully without them. But I think in general we're seeing a decrease in use, and I think we're moving in the right direction.
What kind of vegetable source proteins do you like to see in a starter?
In a starter?
Yes.
Soybean meal is pretty good. It's hard to beat it. I don't think we need to be too fancy, actually. Some of the work that we've done, the work I actually showed you a little bit there, was really just manipulating the amount of soybean meal and relative to other ingredients. So I don't think there's much real evidence to argue that we need to be a lot more complicated than that. Typically there'd be something like alfalfa meal perhaps in there, so that's some other vegetable protein, but it can be pretty simple. Is there something specific that you're thinking about, or?
I don't know. How do you? We have access to a lot of expeller meals.
A lot of expeller meal.
Yeah. How do you feel about those?
Yeah. Again, that can be fine. The work that's compared expeller versus regular, and trying to increase the bypass protein has really not been very exciting to me. Not very positive. I think it's fine. Some of the particularly higher fat products may tend to have a little negative effect on intake, and so that's really the only reason that I would look carefully is to make sure that we're not getting too high in fat, because that literature seems pretty clear that we see a reduction in starter intake as the fat content of the starter increases. Yes, sir.
The amount of starter that they consume in the first 2 weeks, do you think we should stop worrying so much about that and worry more about the amount of starter at the end of as we get the emphasis
Yeah.
switch?
The question was, do we worry too much then about the amount of starter in the first couple of weeks, and should we be more focused on the later period when we're getting closer to weaning? I think yes, but since starter intake is, it essentially doubles every week if you look at a typical calf pattern. And so the earlier you start starter intake, the more quickly it's going to increase. And so I think there needs to be more emphasis maybe on around the time of weaning as to whether that calf is ready, but the early starter intake is pretty important in establishing that intake and allowing it to kind of increase exponentially.
And the old rule of 2 pounds a day and wean them, maybe hold water too much.
I think when we go to these intensified programs, it might be a little low. If the calves are consistently averaging that, they may go through the weaning pretty easily at 2 pounds a day. The problem is a lot of people that say they're eating 2 pounds, they're really maybe only 1.5 pounds. And so having a little bit higher goal might not be a bad idea. Yes?
Well, how much protein do you want in the starter?
For a typical conventional program, there's no need for more than 18%. If we're going to one of the accelerated programs, a little bit higher milk feeding rates, then there is some advantage perhaps to going up to 20 or 22%. Is there a question over here? Yeah.
You talk about intensifying feeding rate and feeding whole milk. What's the cutoff level as far as how much milk you can give before you tip that back and forth?
Yeah, a good way to think about it is essentially double the amount over a conventional program. So if you're feeding 8 pounds of milk a day, you might be able to get up to 15 or 16 per day. With whole milk in particular, there's probably less risk of scouring or abomasal ulcers or something than with a milk replacer. And the calf may not drink all of that at once, particularly the younger calf. So going to 3 feedings a day instead of 2 is advantageous from an intake standpoint. Maybe some gain in efficiency, although the data are not really clear that you get a better feed efficiency if you go to more times per day. But I think it's pretty clear that you can minimize some of the risk for the abomasal ulcers and clostridial type problems with particularly the higher milk replacer feeding rates by splitting that into 3 feedings a day instead of 2. And again, that's another advantage of the automated feeding systems, that you can have multiple meals per day. Does that answer your question?
Along those lines, what vaccinations did you use?
What vaccinations? I am not a veterinarian, and I'm not going to answer that.
I was wondering,
Yeah.
were they vaccinated for Clostridium?
Yeah, we've used the Clostridial vaccinations. I think that's pretty important if you're feeding twice a day, especially. So work with your veterinarian. I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
What day were they dehorning?
That's a good question. I don't remember in those earlier studies. Now we're dehorning pretty early in life, within the first few days with the paste. Or the electric dehorner. We used to use more of that.
Two questions real quick.
Sure.
You didn't quite answer that question on if we, at a time of weaning 6 to 8 weeks, can we introduce small amounts of high-quality alfalfa?
Yeah.
180 or better?
Yeah. So the question was, at the time of weaning, can we introduce small amounts of hay? I think that small amounts of high-quality hay are fine. And what's a small amount? Maybe a quarter a pound per day or something is what we should be using. Just a small flake, handful in those initial feeding periods. I think we still want the predominance of the nutrients coming from starter. So maybe 80% of the nutrients supplied from starter after weaning for some period of time. And there's many reasons for that. The cellulose digesting bacteria just are not developed yet in those young calves. The pH of the rumen is still pretty low, even in a healthy rumen. And so there's a time that's necessary for that rumen to get fully adapted to fiber digestion after the initial process.
Probiotics are not going to help this.
Yeah, probiotics are probably not going to help. No, there's not been any convincing demonstration that you can help speed that rate of fiber digestion.
So would you say 100 days? Grain for 100 days and then introduce hay after 100 days?
Yeah. And again, I have no problem with a small amount of hay. In fact, we were feeding some of these studies, we would feed about 1/2 pound per day per head, along with the grain allowance, to prevent bloating, if nothing else. And I think there's some other advantages that are starting to show up in terms of rumen development. Some interesting recent work that's kind of making us rethink the dogma of no hay, but it still doesn't mean we want to have the calf substituting grain intake for starter or for hay in that very early period. Anything else?
All right. Well, I've been instructed to ask you all to fill out your evaluation forms and leave them in the back. Again, I want to thank you all for coming, and let's thank Dr. Drakely one more time. Thanks. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the show.